Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us online today for this episode of Friday Focus. For anyone that isn't familiar with the format, Friday Focus is an online talk series hosted by the Hunterian, and we are the museum and art gallery at the University of Glasgow. In each edition of these talks, we hear from a different speaker covering a different topic. We tend to look at our exhibitions, displays, research happening here and across the university, as well as all the exciting work that happens behind the scenes with our collections. So this week, we are pleased to be joined by Joseph Sharples, the Curator of Mackintosh and Applied Art and Design collections here at the Hunterian, who will be talking to us about the latest rotation of works on paper at the Hunterian Art Gallery, which includes a fascinating group of drawings, prints and photographs on medieval themes. So Joseph will give us a presentation and then there will be time at the end for any questions you might have. And along the way, you can pop your questions into the chat by clicking on the speech bubble at the bottom of your screen and I can read those out at the very end. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today online. And I'll now hand over to Joseph to deliver this week's talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Zoe, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And as Zoe said, this talks about the latest rotation of works on paper in the Hunterian Art Gallery. We carry out these rotations about 3 times a year. And in the current one, I've included a group of works that relate to the fascination of 19th and early 20th century artists with the medieval world as a source of ideas and images. And in this talk, I'm going to look briefly at each of the 6 works in that group that form the current display in the art gallery. But before I do that, it's just worth saying something, I think, about the 19th century fascination with the Middle Ages, which is most obviously seen, I think, in architecture, because we are surrounded by the legacy of that phase in British architecture, the Gothic revival. And in fact, in Glasgow, we're particularly aware of it because of the Gilbert Scott building, which is one of the most monumental examples of Gothic revival architecture in the UK. And there's another extraordinary example across the other side of the country in Edinburgh, of course, the Scott Monument in Princes Street. And Gothic was, for some people in the 19th century, was just one of a variety of styles that they could adopt at will, depending on their preferences. It was an age of revivalisms and an age of revivalism. And so the architecture of the past in different countries, different times, fed into the architecture of the 19th century. And in fact, if you look closely at that photograph of the Scott Monument, you can just see in the background the Royal Scottish Academy building, a Greek revival building based on the architecture of ancient Greece, only 20 years earlier than the extremely Gothic Scott Monument in the foreground. Gothic was a sort of default choice for university buildings in the 19th century because of its associations with the ancient universities of Oxford and Cambridge. And so you get Gothic buildings in universities all over the country, although it was controversial in Glasgow because there was a strong local case made for having Greek revival buildings for the new university in this extremely classical city. So that's by way of background to the works of art that I'm going to be looking at and the different reasons why artists chose to turn to the 19th century as a source of ideas and images. In the realm of church architecture, the Gothic was seen as having moral qualities. It was seen by the famous architect Augustus Welby Pugin and his followers as being essentially the Christian style of building. For them, it wasn't just a stylistic choice. As Pugin said, it wasn't a style, but a principle. And something of that same attitude to the Middle Ages can be found in the work of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And the first image I'm showing here from the display in the gallery is by one of those artists who in 1848 formed the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, William Holman Hunt. And these artists turned to the art of the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance for what they believed to be its purity and sincerity. And they rejected the developments of the High Renaissance represented by artists like Michelangelo and Raphael. And that's why they assumed the name Pre-Raphaelites. They, among other things, produced a journal in which they published their ideas and also published some of their work. And this etching by William Holman Hunt was first published in the Pre-Raphaelite journal called The Germ. And there's a picture on the right here showing it in its original context in that publication. The print was made as an illustration to two poems by another Pre-Raphaelite artist, a sculptor called Thomas Woolner, famous as a sculptor, but also he was a writer. And he wrote two long poems called My Beautiful Lady and Of My Lady in Death, which were both published in the Germ in 1850. And William Holman Hunt made this image as an illustration to both poems, but combined in one page. The upper section of the print shows the first poem, the subject of the first poem, My Beautiful Lady, and it's a couple of lovers, and the woman, as you can see, is kneeling on the ground and bending over to pick flowers from a stream, and her lover is holding her hand in a sort of protective and anxious way as she leans over the brook. And then in the bottom image, we see the subsequent chapter of the story, as told in the second poem of My Lady in Death, where the distraught lover is lying on the new grave of his now deceased lover, and there's a funeral procession in the background. And this idea of combining two scenes in one in this way, I think relates directly to the example of medieval art, because medieval altarpieces, like the one you can see in the centre here by Giotto of St. Francis, very often included a main devotional image in the top part, and then below a series of smaller scale scenes that represented, well, as in this case, scenes from the life of the saint, whose image is in the top half of the altarpiece. And I think that's what William Holman Hunt had in mind when he combined these two images in this way in his print for the Germ. And it wasn't just Holman Hunt that was interested in this form of medieval religious art. You can see it also reflected in the famous painting of Beata Beatrix by another of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, which is seen on the right here. So the main image of Beatrice in the top half of the picture, but a smaller horizontal panel at the bottom showing the meeting of Dante and Beatrice. And this is the sort of compositional device that Hunt was adopting from medieval art in his print. Woolner's poems are not obviously set in the Middle Ages. There's nothing in the writing that indicates the periods at which the action takes place. So that's a kind of stylistic choice on Hunt's part. And so he's given his figures medieval dress, and the man has a sword at his belt. But he's also adopted a rather archaic, medievalizing way of representing these figures, rather angular and viewed from a rather high viewpoint. And you find this frequently in Pre-Raphaelite painting, and it was much ridiculed by people who disapproved of Pre-Raphaelite affectation, as they would see it. And this cartoon on the right is from Punch, just 5 years earlier than the Holman Hunt etching on the left. A young man about town, brackets Gothic, and he's extremely thin and angular and in an awkward pose, and he's got ridiculously long pointed shoes, and of course Hunt's lover has pointed shoes too. The detail I love about this print, this cartoon, is that the young man about town is holding a square monocle, an amusing comment on the Pre-Raphaelite's love of the angular rather than the round. And in the bottom section of the print, I think you can see even more clearly how Hunt drew on examples from the Middle Ages in creating this design. So behind the foreground figures, you can see a graveyard extending, and the form of the tombs in the graveyard is distinctly medieval, not typical of the 19th century, but a style of monument that 19th century architects like Pugin, for instance, tried to successfully to revive. And so you have this authentic medieval graveyard behind. You've also got the chapel with its tolling bell in Gothic architecture to the right. And most interestingly, I think, you've got this procession of mourners walking behind the prostrate man in the foreground, with their faces buried in their hands, weeping. And I think these figures are clearly derived from figures like the ones shown in the image on the left here. These are very famous figures of mourners from ducal tombs in Dijon from the late 14th, beginning of the 15th century by Klaus Sluter. But there are many other examples of figures of mourners like this associated with medieval tombs. And I think they are probably what Hunt had in mind when he created this funeral procession in the background. So moving on to the next work in the display, I don't want to talk very much about this because it has already been the subject of a Friday Focus talk a few months ago by Claire Wilsden when she talked about the mural scheme for Glasgow City Chambers. And this is a design by E.A. Walton for one of those murals, but one that was never executed, in fact. But it makes a nice continuation of the print that we've just looked at, because like the print, it too seems to replicate the form of Italian altarpieces, in this case, a triptych, so a larger central panel with two narrower side panels. This is actually a reflection of the interior architecture of the banqueting room in the city chambers, where the walls were divided up by pilasters. Nevertheless, I think Walton here was consciously echoing the shape of a medieval altarpiece. And the subject is appropriate to that because the subject is the burial of Fergus, an origin myth associated with the city of Glasgow. So the story recounted by a medieval chronicler is that St. Mungo Kentigern was at the deathbed of a holy man called Fergus. And when Fergus died, Mungo placed his body on a cart drawn by two white bullocks. And where the bullocks came to rest, he buried Fergus, and that became the site of Glasgow Cathedral and indeed of the city of Glasgow. And so this image recalls and commemorates the mythical Christian origins of the city of Glasgow. And 19th century industrial cities like Glasgow were always looking for ways of asserting their history, showing that they weren't just creations of the modern industrial world, but that they had roots going back far into the past, which gave them dignity and importance. And very comparable to Walton's proposal for Glasgow City Chambers is this mural painting by another of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Ford Madox Brown, one of a series that decorate the Great Hall of Manchester Town Hall, another great industrial city of the north of England, which built itself a magnificent town hall in the 1860s and then decorated it with this cycle of mural paintings telling, or in some cases mythologizing, the history and origins of the city. So this shows the baptism of Edwin. It represents the Christianizing of the region in which Manchester is situated, although in fact the baptism of Edwin took place in York. But again, you see the city fathers turning to medieval history to give dignity and significance to their modern city. Well, one of the ways in which late Victorians and Edwardians told their communal histories was through pageants. And these were elaborate community performances with costumes and processions, telling the story of a place and its history. And it was only very recently that we discovered that this famous well-known photograph of Margaret Macdonald relates to one such pageant. As you can see, she's wearing a fancy dress. And until recently, we only knew what the upper half of her costume looked like. But recently, there came to light in Glasgow University Archives and Special Collections a full-length photograph of Margaret Macdonald wearing this costume. And you can see her train spread out behind her and her long cloak. And these photographs record her participation in the 1908 Scottish National Pageant, which took place in Sawton Park in Edinburgh in association with the Scottish National Exhibition held in that year. And as part of that pageant, Scottish artists and writers contributed a section devoted to the story of King Arthur, the Arthurian legends. And here's a photograph that was published in the Illustrated London News to commemorate the Glasgow contingent and their contribution to the 1908 pageant. And it's helpfully got a key at the bottom to say who various people are. So the cloaked figure of King Arthur, to the left of the centre there, seen in profile, is James Craig Annan, celebrated Glasgow photographer, and we'll see more of him in a minute. And Agnes Rayburn, I think, is the kneeling figure in the foreground. And there are various other names that you recognise if you read through that list. James Craig Annan, as well as featuring in the pageant and in this photograph, also took a series of photographs of individual participants, and the photograph of Margaret Macdonald that we have in our display and that I showed a moment ago is one of those photographs. But here are some others to give you a sense of how Annan saw the performance and perhaps how the performers saw themselves. And these photographs, I think, are directly comparable to late Pre-Raphaelite paintings. Well, they're also comparable to the well-known photographs of Tennyson and others in medieval costume that were taken by Julia Margaret Cameron slightly earlier. But these, I think, are directly to be compared with late Pre-Raphaelite paintings, so the works of artists like John William Waterhouse and late Burne-Jones and Rossetti and so on, this dreamy, visionary, romantic view of the medieval past. The figures on the right are the kneeling figure is Sir Galahad, embodied by the furniture designer E.A. Taylor, and the sort of ghostly figure behind him, about to place a wreath on his head, is the Angel of the Holy Grail, played by Jessie M. King, the Glasgow artist who was married to E.A. Taylor. And Jessie M. King was responsible for designing the costumes for this pageant, which were very highly praised by contemporaries. Well, as I've just alluded to in relation to Julia Margaret Cameron's photography, the Arthurian myth was popularised for Victorians by the poetry of Alfred Lord Tennyson. Tennyson's poems were, to a large extent, based on the collected Arthurian stories put together by Thomas Malory in the late 15th century. But Tennyson made them available to and enjoyed by a very wide Victorian audience. And Tennyson became an enormously important source of themes and subjects for Victorian artists, most notably the Pre-Raphaelites. And some of the Pre-Raphaelites contributed to this famous illustrated edition of Tennyson's poetry, the so-called Moxon Tennyson that came out in 1857. And on the right here is a page from Moxon's Tennyson with another illustration by Holman Hunt, who we began with this time, of the Lady of Shalott. Jessie M. King, who designed those costumes for the pageant in Edinburgh, was the inheritor of this tradition established by the Pre-Raphaelites of interpreting the Arthurian legend as retold by Tennyson. And she did that in a large book with many illustrations called The High History of the Holy Grail, but also in this smaller publication, a single poem, although a long poem, called Elaine by Tennyson, which was published with illustrations by Jessie M. King. The story is not unlike The Lady of Shalott. Elaine is a young woman who lives in a castle and spends a lot of time alone in a tower in the castle. And the castle is visited by Sir Lancelot, who leaves his shield there. And Elaine embroiders a special cover for the shield, and she almost sort of fetishizes this shield and falls in love with Lancelot. But inevitably, her love is unrequited, and she returns the shield to him, and then she pines away and dies. And this is the title page with one of King's illustrations, and on the right, another illustration from within the text. And in the exhibition display that we have at the Hunterian Art Gallery, we have one of King's original drawings for this edition of Elaine. So the slightly cryptic title, "And Gave the Naked Shield," is a quotation from the poem where Elaine, realizing that she isn't loved in return by Lancelot, removes the embroidered cover that she's made for his shield and gives him the now naked shield. And that's what she's doing in this extremely elaborate and finely wrought drawing, which you can see the whole of on the left and a detail of on the right. I think it's worth saying that the drawing is in ink on vellum, so it's using a kind of medieval technique as well as having a medieval subject. And in the detail on the right, you can perhaps see Elaine removing the embroidered cover from the shield, but you can also see the elaborate treatment of the, I suppose it's a bench, a piece of furniture in the background, with all this intricate interlacing floral ornament, reminiscent to some extent of the work of the Glasgow School of Designers, the Macdonald sisters, and Mackintosh and McNair and their followers. Well, of course, this sort of intense medievalism was ripe for satire and for ridicule, and we've already seen an example of that in that Punch cartoon of 1850. But here is a comic drawing by an amateur Glasgow artist of a later generation. So Osborne Henry Mavor was what, sort of 40 years, drawing this sort of 40 years later than the Glasgow Four had got together. And by this date, he could treat them irreverently. Mavor studied medicine at Glasgow University, but he became more famous as a playwright, and he wrote dozens of plays, and he was one of the founders of the Citizens Theatre in Glasgow, although he did continue to practice medicine. But early on, he was also a satirical draftsman, and we have dozens of drawings of this type in the collection. You know, I think this is sort of directly comparable to Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's having a laugh at the madness of the imitation of the medieval past. But I think also Mavor is making a joke at the expense of some of those artists of the previous generation. So the style of draftsmanship here is very closely related to the work of Aubrey Beardsley. And in fact, Aubrey Beardsley had uh, illustrated the Arthurian legends in a famous publication, and I'm showing a couple of examples of his work on that on the right here. But more generally, the style of black and white draftsmanship here is very closely related to a lot of Beardsley's non-Arthurian illustrations. But I wonder also whether Mather was having gentle fun with the Glasgow artists that I've just mentioned, the Mackintosh, McNair, and the Macdonald sisters, who of course were themselves highly influenced by the work of Aubrey Beardsley in the 1890s. And I think if you look closely at the image on the left, Mather's drawing, you see these strange triangular trees in front of the tower in the background. Well, they're not a million miles from the strange triangular tree that the Macdonald sisters drew as the title page of their Christmas story in 1896. And on the right is an archival photograph of a watercolour by Macdonald, illustrating not in this case a poem by Tennyson, but actually a poem by William Morris, that other great enthusiast for the revival of the Middle Ages, around about the same date, with a swooning maiden being embraced by a knight in armour. And so I think that Mather is having some gentle fun at the expense of the Glasgow Four, as well as Aubrey Beardsley. Well, this brings us to the last picture in the display that I want to talk about. And this is a drawing by Anne Dunlop Alexander. She's a little known today, little known Glasgow artist, but she trained at the Glasgow School of Art. She worked as an illustrator, and she taught art at Hillhead School, so just a stone's throw from the university. And this is one of a series of illustrations she made for a 1927 publication, Women of the Morte d'Arthur. So another work derived from those medieval legends, compiled by Thomas Malory and then rewritten, as we've seen, by Alfred Lord Tennyson. These drawings were obviously designed for lithographic reproduction in the book, but they're also, I think, intended to look like woodcuts. So she's, although she hasn't made the images by that technique, they're designed to evoke that medieval technique of reproducing drawings with their simplified contrast of black and white. And I think she's even trying to evoke the most famous exponent of the woodcut, Albrecht Dürer, in the use of that A monogram, which you can see in the bottom corner of this image, and which you see a comparable monogram on Dürer's works. This is her design for the cover of the Women of the Morte d'Arthur, and the subtitle, I think, makes clear that the mood of the book, 12 of the most romantic of the world's love stories. So we've come a very long way from the world of unrequited love and tragedy that tends to characterize the work of the Pre-Raphaelites and their later followers, even Jessie and King, in their interpretation of the Arthurian myth. And we're now much closer, I think, to the world of medievalizing film. There's a nice comparison to be made between a still like this one from the film called Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood. That's the full title of the film, which came out a couple of years before Anne Dunlop Alexander produced her illustrations for the Women of the Morte d'Arthur. And even more striking, perhaps, the comparison between this image on the left and another still from Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood. So, as I say, we've come a long way from the earnestness and seriousness and moral intent of those first images by the Pre-Raphaelites that we looked at to something altogether more entertaining. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks for sharing your insights into this fascinating topic. And please do, anyone, if you have questions, you can pop them in the chat and I can read them out. But I wondered, so you mentioned that this style of art became subject to satire, and I wondered to what extent that the audiences who originally received these works of art you've discussed were similarly engaged with the medieval themes and influences that inspired these artists.
I'm having difficulty hearing you. Sorry, there seems to be some interference on the line. But there was a question was about audiences for these works?
Yes, so to what extent the audiences were similarly engaged with these medieval themes and influences that inspired the artists?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think you see certain tendencies in probably in dress, but certainly in furniture. So the things that people surrounded themselves with who are enthusiasts for this kind of art that are like the paintings modelled on medieval examples. So furniture and painted furniture becomes popular with enthusiastic followers of the Pre-Raphaelites and other medievalizing artists. Not so sure about dress, but I would think there would be examples. Maybe not pointy shoes, but
Well, that's lovely, and I think that's all we have time for today. So thank you again, Joseph, and thank you all for joining us today. A recording of this Friday Focus will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And with that, have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you.